Good afternoon. I'm Randy Horton. Welcome here to the webinar on behalf of myself, Bernhard Kappa and Jim Hewitt from Orthogonal, and Buddy Smith from our good friends and partners in this webinar series at MedSec. We're excited to see so many of you here. Thanks a lot for logging in today, taking time out of your very busy schedules. You know, you have a lot of choices of things you can spend your time on, so we don't take it for granted you're giving it to us here. We're going to try and really give you a ton of content and value, pack more than 4 hours of content into anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes, depending on how long you stay. The people who are going to be featured today in the discussion and talking have a lot of expertise about designing Bluetooth for safe and effective medical devices. You'll learn more about them as they come around to their talking. Next slide, please. So Orthogonal has been doing webinars for the last year or so on monthly, on really just trying to help people accelerate the development of safe and effective medical devices. Today's webinar is the first one in a series that we're going to be doing specifically focused around more of a vertical topic, which is Bluetooth, and using Bluetooth between smartphones and other consumer mobile devices and regulated medical devices for diagnostic monitoring and therapeutics. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, actually, you're already there. Never mind. For this series, we're going to be doing webinars, blogs, white papers. There's links there if you want to look up the content. You can also, when you go to the website, sign up for monthly notifications from Orthogonal and MedSec. We'd love to hear your topics of what it is you want to cover today. Our goal for you for this session is to really give you sort of a crash course in some of the considerations you want to take into account if you're embarking on the challenge of connecting Bluetooth with consumer smartphones via Bluetooth with medical devices. It's not plug and play, but it's a very interesting area. As we say, it doesn't just work, but the good news is it doesn't have to be as hard as a lot of people really perceive it to be or think it is. And finally, while we certainly did not convene you here to give you a sales pitch and will not do that, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that Orthogonal is available to work with you if you have further questions or feel you need some help on doing Bluetooth to medical device connection, as is MedSec, in terms of ensuring that your Bluetooth implementations and your device implementations are secure. Very quick story from me. I think we've all had that moment in the last, 15 years where we've realized, wow, Bluetooth is really neat, but it can really go wrong. You know, drop connections or different things. The story I like to tell that to me showed both the promise and the peril of Bluetooth was my son, who was maybe 10 years old at the time, was with some cousins at Fry's Electronics, which is now gone, if any of you remember that store. And he had his phone and he had some music on it, and he decided to connect it to a little Bluetooth speaker that was right there in the store to see how it would play. So he connected to the speaker, but the speaker he connected to wasn't the little one there. It was the speaker system for the entire massive Fry's store. And all of a sudden it starts blaring. I know it was probably like Disney's High School Musical or something. And everybody from the store starts scurrying around trying to figure out what's going on while my son's trying to disconnect the Bluetooth. So I think in many ways that's emblematic of a lot of the things we see. We have chat open. We'd love to see questions from you along the way. We've also gotten a bunch of questions ahead of time. Very quickly, as we've promised, in 50 minutes, we will get through the core content and some core discussion here and try and answer some questions. You could drop off at that point. You'll have gotten sort of the promised content. That said, we usually stay on for about a full 90 minutes, so until 1:30 p.m. Eastern time, as long as there's more questions to answer. And generally, we actually get a pretty good crowd staying and continuing to ask questions. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Bernhard Kappa.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Let me start by giving you kind of a little bit of a background, right? We're talking about Bluetooth in the context of smartphones and connecting to smartphones. And it's good to go back to sort of where we were early on, right? In 2007, Steve Jobs announced the first iPhone. And then in 2011, Mark Andreessen, the inventor of the Netscape browser, and Andreessen Horowitz, venture capital firm, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, the thesis of which was basically that software is eating the world and every company will eventually become a software company. And if you look at what's happened since then, that's largely proven true. And the iPhone and the Android phones that followed have contributed mightily to that. It's been almost 16 years since that first iPhone was introduced, and there's been a lot of evolution in that time, right? The processing power has gone up 500-fold. The cellular network data throughput is something like 2,000 times faster. And the phones have 32 times the storage. And instead of a 2 megapixel camera, they've got 3 backward facing 12 megapixel cameras, and then a forward facing camera as well. And at the beginning, that first year, the iPhone sold 1.4 million units. That's a lot, but if we look at where we're at now, there are 7.3 billion plus smartphones, so iPhones and Android phones out there in the world. Most of those being replaced every few years or so. So really, it's taken over the world. And the apps at the beginning, there were only the apps that Apple had. Now they're on the Apple App Store, over 2 million apps, and they cover just about everything in your life that you can imagine, and that you want, or in some cases don't want as well. More and more of those are also medical apps and medical device connected apps. The first one we worked on was way back in 2012. It was a Bluetooth connected app for the for Roche Diagnostics, the AccuCheck Connect app that connected to via Bluetooth to a glucometer and included an insulin bolus calculator. So it was actually a class 2 medical device. There's been since then lots and lots of activity in the medical device space. If we look at kind of some of the trends in that evolution, let's look at a couple of examples. So in point of care diagnostics, on the left-hand side, you see the Sophia 2 point of care diagnostic device. If you bring your kids to the doctor's office, as I did recently, to check for strep throat or COVID or something like that, there's a lateral flow assay that goes in here. So take a swab, lateral flow assay, and 10 minutes later, you get a result, positive or negative. The latest version here that we worked on is a Sophia Q device on the right side. And in that case, you can see that it is a much smaller device. In fact, it's got a lot less smarts in there. The bill of materials is much, much lower. It connects via Bluetooth to a smartphone, and the smartphone would read the barcode on the assay, knows what kind of a test it is, and then tells the device what to do, pulls the data out. It's got a data pipeline and an AI algorithm in the in the application. So it's a locked model, and that actually provides the outputs and then sends that data up to the cloud, and then from there on to the CDC. So the trend here is more of the smarts and the functionality moving from the device in many cases. And the how much the device itself costs to produce and how quickly you can scale production is pretty dramatic. Another example is in the spinal cord nerve stimulators. So these are implanted nerve stimulators, typically for pain, although there are other indications as well. And early on, the first ones had remotes that, as you can see, were pretty, simple interfaces for this. A couple of buttons and some lights and some beeps, etc. Not particularly sophisticated, but they did the job for what folks initially wanted to do. At some point later on, St. Jude Medical actually decided to add Bluetooth to their spinal cord nerve stimulators and provide an iPod Touch with the nerve stimulator, and and it was a much better and richer interface that they could provide with that. Look to the latest evolution. This was released sometime in I believe December last year from Nevro. Their latest spinal cord nerve stimulator has an application that is BYOD, so it's on a patient's smartphone rather than a smartphone that is provided by the manufacturer, and it includes the same initial functionality for changing the settings on the nerve stimulator, but it also will pull in information from the patient in terms of how they're feeling, symptoms, etc., and then can feed those into an AI algorithm for recommending better therapy settings for them. And in addition to that, you can actually set your device into MRI safe mode so that you can safely go through an MRI machine with a spinal cord stimulator, inside your body, and then also take it back out of MRI safe mode. So the trend here is just, again, more functionality, but a lot more that you can do with these things than you could early on, that creates more benefits for the patients, allows them to get better therapy, more convenience in their life, etc. That's happening in a lot of areas, and you can see the trend. You start with something where it's like, oh, we'll do something a little bit like this, and the next company will sort of one up. I'm sure St. Jude, for example, is working on responses to what Nevro has done in this particular case. So smartphones are super useful, super convenient. There's obvious reasons why people end up doing work with smartphones, but they're really different than what you have on the device side, right? On the device side, that device is in your control. The software, firmware, everything is in your control. But you also have the cost of memory, space for processor. If you wanted to connect it via cellular data or something else, you may have costs associated with that as well. On the smartphone, it is not a medical device. It is a consumer device, and the primary kind of directive that Apple and Samsung and everyone else has for these things is these have to be useful and convenient for consumers for all the things that are sitting on that device. We know from what I'd shown you before, they're getting more and more powerful, but there's also many models and many OS versions that are out there. You have to think about both the models themselves, but the different operating system versions that may be on those models. There are hundreds that are generally in use, but it's actually the number of device profiles, those combinations in the US alone that are in the market are over 12,000. So different animal in this case. There are also frequent updates. You don't necessarily control the updates. You do if you have smartphones that you are managing, say, for your company. But otherwise, if they are patient smartphones, that's Apple's or the user's discretion in terms of when they do updates. In general, it's not all in your control, and you're just one of the many apps on the phone. So that's the situation you have to deal with when you, on the negative side, when you're dealing with smartphones. You can get into lots of people's pockets. It's super convenient for them. You can leverage their data plan as opposed to your own data plan, but you have a lot more complexity and change that you have to deal with. So if we get into Bluetooth, and most of the time when we're talking about this, we're talking about Bluetooth connectivity for medical devices. The Bluetooth is actually controlled by the Bluetooth Special Interest Group, or Bluetooth SIG, The latest version of Bluetooth is, I believe, 5.3 now. But there's actually, within that Bluetooth standard, multiple types of Bluetooth that really don't have that much to do with each other. So one of them is Bluetooth Classic. The typical things here: audio streaming and data transfer. Your right now, at least, Bluetooth speakers, headphones, etc., are mostly using Bluetooth Classic. And then there's Bluetooth Low Energy, which is, as the name says, lower energy consumption, but also lower bandwidth, and is a totally different specification, really, that you have. Most of the time when we are dealing with Bluetooth for medical devices, we are dealing with Bluetooth low energy. Early on, I know we worked on somewhere we were using Bluetooth Classic, but it's been at least 8 years since we've done anything with Bluetooth Classic for medical devices. So when we get to Bluetooth Low Energy, or BLE, we have to think about the concept of peripheral and central. So what happens is, before you're connected, a peripheral is advertising, and a central is listening for those advertisements, and then sends a connection requests and connects to the peripheral. Once they're connected, you have a child device and a parent device, and each of those can act as a client or server. So that's the mechanism you have for connecting between devices. And if we look at the smartphone side, I would say almost all of the use cases that we see, the smartphone is the central and not the peripheral. So if I am connecting my smartphone to a glucometer, for example, and getting data from that, typically that is the smartphone as the central and the glucometer as the peripheral. Or if I am connecting to a CGM, or if I'm changing settings on a nerve stimulator. There are some exceptions, which we can talk about in another webinar, but almost all of them that are cleared by the FDA end up being smartphone as central, not as peripheral. So the peripheral device has to advertise, and then the smartphone can connect to that. One of the things that we see a lot, it's a simple mistake, is to think that, oh, the peripheral can sort of be dormant and just wake up the phone when it needs to do something. But that's not really how it works. Or the smartphone can't wake up the peripheral. In order to connect, the peripheral has to be advertising on some kind of regular basis, and the smartphone can then connect. So it has a lot of consequences, especially for background processing. So if we're looking at background mode, right, again, keep in mind that the smartphone is a consumer device. Battery life is at a premium. They want the app that is in the foreground, what the smartphone user wants to do right now, to be the most important thing. So it gets most of the processing power, on the primary thread, etc. But there's the need for background processing. So when an app is in the background, so either the screen is off or another app is on screen, it's in background mode. And in order to do anything in background mode, you actually have to, as part of your development process, make sure that you indicate that you have tasks that are scheduled. So you need to tell the operating system that you are scheduling tasks on some frequency. Then in background mode, the app is launched on that scheduled event. You run your tasks, and then you complete your tasks, and you sort of go back into a dormant state. That is what happens. And if you, for example, are connecting to a CGM and need to get data every 2 minutes in background mode, that is what you're doing on some kind of a frequency, likely a lot more than every 2 minutes in order to get that information. So in background mode, you have limited time to run tasks, typically somewhere around 10 seconds. You can ask for more data, but it is up to the operating system to grant you those things depending on what else is going on. So you've got less throughput in background mode than you would if you are in foreground mode. And of course, when you are in low power mode, which can happen when you're when you're down to a small percentage of your battery left, or you choose to go into low power mode, background app refresh is disabled. So you're not going to get any data through in that particular case. Also, when the user closes an app, as you see here, on iOS, when you swipe up on your list of apps, you're closing that app. There is no background app refresh. And remember, even if the peripheral says, "Hey, I want you to wake up," there's no mechanism for doing that on BLE. Another important concept here for BLE in general, but on the smartphone, is pairing. So pairing is registering the devices with each other so they can connect securely. You need pairing in order to do any kind of encryption. And then bonding is the concept of actually storing that pairing information on the devices so that the pairing process doesn't have to be repeated. We've done apps in some rare cases where there is no bonding and you have to pair every time. It's not very convenient to have to go through the full pairing process. If you are bonded, then it automatically will it can do those types of things. There are different sets of pairing methods. The most common one and default one is just works. There's a temporary key. It's set to 0, so pretty much it just works. It's not particularly secure, and in some cases that's totally fine, but for medical devices, very rarely have we seen anyone want to do just works. Then there are a whole bunch of other things: numeric comparisons, out of band pairing, which is exchanging keys using a different technology. It could be a wireless technology like NFC that is very common, but sometimes it's also automatic key generation that a user ends up seeing on one device, or even the device sees on another device, like a barcode or a QR code, and then uses that for the pairing. The Apple Watch, for example, uses that. Passkeys and LE secure connection. These are things we're going to get into a lot more in a future webinar on where we talk about cybersecurity. Another thing to think about here is that if you delete the registration, either the device or the phone, or you get a new device or a phone, you're going to have to pair again. So there's a bunch of use cases that we see. There may be more, but the ones we most commonly see are things like a single data fetch. So a pulse oximeter, a glucometer, where we connect in foreground mode, we get a reading, we display the reading and do something else with that. Or changing settings on a device. So a spinal cord nerve stimulator, where we are changing something to MRI safe mode or back, or changing settings on a stimulator is another one. In foreground or in background, over-the-air updates for device firmware, that's pretty common. And chip makers like Nordic actually have SDKs for doing that in a secure fashion that we often leverage for over-the-air updates. Periodic data collection alerts, so CGMs as an example, where again every couple of minutes you're getting data, and then on the application or on the watch, you're getting alerts and you can actually see what's happening, hypoglycemic and hyperglycemic events, etc. And then streaming data, so cardiac monitoring would be one of those things where you are pulling waveform data on some kind of a sampling level continuously, and either viewing that or also pulling that through to the back end for algorithms to actually for monitoring and risk stratification, etc. Another thing to think about there with these use cases is when you are doing pairing, typically you're trying to do one-to-one pairing, but you may have one-to-many pairing or many-to-one pairing, or even many-to-many pairing situations. An example here might be if you have multiple children's with CGMs, and you are actually the one that is monitoring this information, then you may be pairing with multiple devices. So there are a bunch of things and usability issues you want to think about when you have that. How do you know you have the right one for the right person, or an insulin pump for that matter? There's risk in those cases. You may end up in a situation where you have many devices and many smartphones. So, for example, if you are implanting something in an operating room, there may be a lot of devices that are already on, and you want to be able to pair to the correct one. If there are 20 devices sitting there and 20 smartphones, you have some interesting challenges in that regard. As I say, we're going to be dealing with a lot of these things in future webinars, but really there's a number of key considerations for when you're doing BLE in general, but also in particular connecting to a smartphone that you have to think about. So security, there's a bunch of different types of attacks and different ways that you can go about mitigating the attack vectors and surfaces. So man-in-the-middle attacks, identity tracking, passive eavesdropping, phone hacks of some kind as well, not just on the Bluetooth connection, and cloud hacks that could be, result in issues as well. And then again, because it's a consumer device and because of a lot of the different things that can happen, there are a lot of edge cases. We, over time, have built out a library of dozens, not quite 100 edge cases that we look at when we're looking at the different use cases and scenarios. So obviously sort of dropped connections, intermittent connections, loss of data, lots of data that if you have a device that is connecting and collecting data for 3 months and you connect the smartphone for the first time, how do you deal with that data? What data do you want first? What data do you want last? How do you recover from crashes? How do you deal with low power mode? We have a couple that we've nicknamed Siberia and Niagara Falls. Siberia has something to do with sort of synchronizing clock times. In most countries, the smartphone is automatically syncing up to a universal clock. But in Russia, they don't actually do that. Niagara Falls, again, is if you are going between two different countries and you have different cellular services, those are issues that you may end up dealing with. There's a whole bunch of those, and I think we're going to be dealing with those edge cases in another webinar. At a high level, we list those out, and we have various ways of testing for those edge cases as part of our verification processes, and then platform compatibility testing. Another important consideration is that just because a device, a smartphone says, I'm compatible with Bluetooth X, does that mean that it has all of the features? Eventually, they will get most of the features, but especially for Bluetooth 5, for example, early on, not all of those phones had all of the Bluetooth 5 features. So you want to be very careful what features you are leveraging and using as part of that. And then a BYOD testing strategy is the next piece of that, right? If you are doing something where it is bring your own smartphone, how do you test for all of the permutations, or do you test for all of the permutations? Again, we'll talk about that in more detail, and obviously can answer questions around this. There are also differences between how Android and iOS behave. And Bluetooth is an evolving standard. So we're going to be talking about where is Bluetooth going in the future. And last but not least, there are the regulatory considerations. Early on when we were first doing mobile apps that were part of an FDA filing, the FDA actually asked for human factor studies to see whether someone could download the app from the App Store. Those aren't things that they care about anymore. They don't see that as a big risk. But similarly with Bluetooth, there's sort of two things going on. One, they're more comfortable with it for certain types of things, and in terms of BYOD. So early on, only phones that you had tested that exact model and that operating system version were allowed. That's been relaxed, although for class 3 devices, it's not so relaxed at this point. But the other part is, as we saw with the nerve stimulators, we have more and more sophisticated features and more risk on the client side of that as well. So there are a number of strategies around how you go about testing and mitigating those risks. A lot of that comes down to your BYOD testing strategy. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Randy.
Okay, great. So actually we have an in summary, but before that, in case anybody drops off, there's a question that came in. I feel like we need to answer immediately for those of you who actually have active implantables. It says, in MRI safe mode, is the device turned off? Bernhard?
No, it's not. It's put into MRI safe modes, which is a low power mode, not turned off. So remember, this is a headless device, right? It's implanted. It does not have a button on the outside of the body. And so, yeah, it's turning it off means, is a difficult thing to do there. Not impossible, but obviously if you run out of battery power, you do have external chargers, et cetera, for this. So.
Thank you. We worry obviously about harming patients, but I didn't want this to be the first webinar where I was accused of harming a webinar attendee specifically. So thank you for covering that. Okay, so in summary, quickly, how do you approach developing Bluetooth-enabled device solutions, or at least how do we do it at Orthogonal? And I'm sure that Buddy can speak to that at MedSec. Really what it comes down to is, how do you plan to use the Bluetooth, right? What are your intended uses? What are the use cases? Who's using it in what situations? What problems are you using Bluetooth to solve? And at that point, this will sound pretty familiar, but basically you design the solution with those requirements in mind, functional, many non-functional requirements, and you take a risk-based approach. So it's really sort of, there's known knowns, such as edge cases we've already encountered that you want to keep in mind. So hopefully you can, how do we say, make new and interesting mistakes, not old and proven ones. And then there's sort of known unknowns, which are things that you want to de-risk with early technical proofs of concepts, things such as a device simulator, which we can talk about. Just to reiterate, this is the beginning of a whole bunch of content that's been coming out. So we hope you continue to join us and refer us on if you feel so inclined, and give us suggestions and questions. So with that, we are going to flip it. We can close the deck and we'll introduce our panelists here. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to quickly introduce themselves. And also, Bernhard, maybe if you could just say 2-3 sentences about orthogonal and what we do. You know, again, we don't try and sell, but people find it a little weird if we don't say at all what we do. And, you know, Jim Keller, if you could maybe just say a couple sentences about MedSec and what you do for context.
I'll start then. So I'm Bernhard Kappe, founder and CEO of Orthogonal. Orthogonal designs and builds connected device systems and software as a medical device. We apply modern methods, agile development, DevOps, fast feedback loops to really move faster while not breaking anything, as Randy is fond of saying, really making sure we're improving patient safety and staying in compliance with the regulations.
Great. Okay, I'm going to introduce briefly Jim Keller from MedSec. Jim, like me, is not a technologist, but he can he can speak to MedSec as a firm, and certainly, you know, if anybody is interested in speaking more deeply, Jim or Buddy can be reached out to. So, Jim, who are you, and what do you guys do?
Yeah, thanks, Randy. I'm really pleased to be participating in this program and to join with Orthogonal. And I'm the VP for Marketing and Business Development for MedSec, and I actually have a technology or master's degree in biomedical engineering. But yeah, Buddy's the real technical specialist here, and he'll be providing some good commentary during this part of the program. But MedSec is a firm that provides medical device cybersecurity consulting and testing. So we help medical device companies with compliance, providing the cybersecurity elements of a regulatory submission, responding to findings from FDA, help with planning around cybersecurity for medical devices. We do a lot of threat modeling, and we do a lot of penetration testing. And that's an area that Buddy's very involved with. And we work with all types of medical device manufacturers, from startups to the big multinational firms, and can provide support for US-based regulatory submissions and testing and so forth, but also outside of the US.
Great, thanks. Okay, Jim.
And I will say that we share clients and collaborate with MedSec and think very highly of them.
Yeah, thanks, Bernhard. And we're really looking forward to participating in some of the upcoming webinars. I think it will be a great collaboration.
Okay, thanks. All right, so Buddy and then Jim Hewitt. So Buddy, maybe introduce yourself. And I'll just say the next two people you're going to meet, who are sort of the deep experts on this, have bottomless wells of knowledge. Like they may be some of the only people who have actually read all 1,600 pages of the Bluetooth spec, or can, you know, in Buddy's case, probably cite any number of regulations going back any number of years and tie that to what you need to be doing today. So
my name is Buddy. I'm the Director of Technical Consulting here at MedSec. So I help our clients in penetration testing, as well as on the regulatory side when they get a question from, say, the FDA about how they're implementing security, or is the cryptography they've chosen appropriate. That's where I step in to help address those questions. I like to say I am a little bit more than an amateur cryptographer, but I do not have an advanced degree in theoretical mathematics, or I'd probably be working for the NSA. I know just enough to be dangerous. Before I was in security, my background was embedded firmware development, and I did a lot of work with things like set-top boxes and video encryption and bootloaders, which sort of drove my passion for securing devices. And the very first time I got to work on a medical device from security, I became very passionate about it.
excellent. Thank you. Jim Hewitt, you there?
Yeah, I have been working with Orthogonal for a little bit better than 11 years at this point in time. My actual technical background is in electronics, but have been working in software and firmware in the medical industry for probably the last 25 years. And am more than happy to help with any answers to any questions you have.
Right. So we've got a ton of questions that have come in, many of which came before. Actually, if Jim and Buddy, if you both just could stay on with video and audio, I think it'll be a little easier for us. So I tried to do some organization of these, and I'll probably combine some and restate some in a little bit of terms. So let's go through a couple, and these really go from forest to trees. Some of them are extremely detailed tree root technical questions, which we may get to a general level, but actually what I'm thinking we'll do is this might be a good opportunity for sort of a set of blogs with Ask Dr. Bluetooth, where we actually address some of the really technical questions, rather than dragging all of you through this. But I guess if you have super technical ones, we get enough requests, we can cover it. Okay, so let's start with, it's a medical device, risk. How do you think about risk with Bluetooth, risk-based design, that's different or the same than everything else we do on devices?
One of the things that you'll hear a lot from regulators like the FDA is they want you to have defense in depth, so your security controls have layers. And one of the things that they're really looking for, especially in your threat model, is showing by design that your device is safe, even if all of the security controls are compromised. So one of the things they think about in risk is, if we didn't have this control, would our device still function safely, even if it might not function as well as we would like it to? So one of the things that we think about in risk is the risk to actual patient harm versus just a security risk. And I think Jim can speak more to how we approach that with MedSec side. We sort of separate security risk and penetration testing and threat modeling from safety risk. And we do ask our clients to work on their own safety risk assessments, but we'll help them with that. So I will pass the buck over to Jim for a little bit more detail on that.
Sure, I'm happy to provide some perspectives on that. And I think the biggest part of that is looking at the clinical impact of like a problem with a cybersecurity breach on the medical device, and making sure that you've covered all of those for the particular use cases for your product. And we'll work with our clients to help them do that at the cybersecurity level, making sure that we've covered all the clinical risks as well as the technical risks.
I was going to ask Bernhard, do you have comment on sort of the non-cybersecurity in terms of just the device working?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's the, so there's two ways to look at this, right? One, if you've got Bluetooth in there, what you have is a more complex system. It's not a standalone, it's not connected. This is a connected system, and to some extent, it is a distributed system that you're dealing with, right? So all the cybersecurity issues that come with that are part of that. As far as patient risk goes, some of those cybersecurity risks can end up being patient risks as well. But but not all of them are, right? But if we're dealing with patient risk for this, it depends on really what it is that you are doing on the smartphone side and what's the impact of that. So if we take MRI safe mode as an example, what you're starting with what can go wrong with MRI safe mode, and then go top down or bottom up for how those harms and hazards can occur for this, and how can you tell if they've occurred or not, and what are the mitigations. So it's a standard risk management process that you're doing. We tend to combine patient risk and cybersecurity risk management because they go kind of hand in hand in that regard. But really, yeah, you're working through those types of things and what are the particular issues that can happen within it.
Right.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about BLE, it is kind of a paradigm shift because previously a lot of implantable devices communicated over a proprietary encryption and frequency spectrum. I think it was around 405 megahertz, called MICS, or Medical Implant Communication Service. And nothing outside of medical devices was allowed to use that spectrum. Whereas now with BLE, you're not just sharing the spectrum with commodity devices, you're also sharing your communications with any other application that's on a bonded device. I think it's something that we can definitely talk about in the security webinar.
Right.
Yep.
So a related question, somebody actually did one of these. I love these. I'm going to step back and ask a higher level question. Question they wrote was, why BLE rather than Wi-Fi Direct? But I would say, why BLE rather than any other wireless protocol?
I will say, especially if you're doing something in the consumer realm, right, where you are out in the wild and a consumer is basically connecting via Wi-Fi to their own home Wi-Fi network. Well, one, you're reliant on Wi-Fi. So if you are traveling somewhere, that's not going to, not really going to work. You're going to have intermittent connectivity. The other part is, if you think about that Wi-Fi connectivity, you can have a Wi-Fi network between the two parts, but then if it is a smartphone, for example, the Wi-Fi and it's a Wi-Fi network specifically between the smartphone and the device, the smartphone can't use another Wi-Fi network, right? So it's really limiting that. And the other part is, if you are just using connecting both things to a home Wi-Fi network, what the top two passwords are for home Wi-Fi networks: password and 1, 2, 3, 4. So not particularly secure in comparison to other things, right? So those are some issues that I would say you have to deal with Wi-Fi.
Excellent.
And Bluetooth Low Energy is much more power efficient than
Yes.
Wi-Fi Direct, especially for implantables. You have a very, very constrained power budget because you don't want you to have to change your implantable device every couple of years. These things have 20 to 30 year lifetimes with batteries, and that's really, really tight power budget.
Yep, very good point.
Could you maybe give a brief overview of how big of a leap it was going from Bluetooth Classic to BLE in terms of throughput, power consumption, and distance?
I think it's evolved over time. Obviously, it's a Bluetooth 5 is much more than Bluetooth 4 was in terms of how efficient and fast BLE 5 is compared to BLA 4, and then what the distances you can have as well as security. So it's evolved in that regard. I don't have the details on, say, if you were comparing Bluetooth Classic to BLE, but I can tell you that Bluetooth Classic uses a lot more power than BLE does.
It's significant. The one factoid I read was that BLE was designed specifically with the idea of, aside from physical barriers, covering anywhere and connecting any 2 points in a house, as opposed to being in the same room. Okay, so somebody had a question about, okay, so take a risk-based approach, come to the FDA with that. And the question is, hey, what guidelines, documents, best practice, where do I go read stuff to tell me how to do that well?
So I would say the FDA pre-market draft guidance that's been released, I believe, in 2022 is very good. And while it's still officially a draft, the FDA is very much enforcing it, especially with the new Omnibus Act. They've started to take a much tighter approach to security. So if you haven't read the FDA guidance for pre-market submissions. I highly recommend it. It's pretty approachable. Another recommendation for security, NIST does have a guide to Bluetooth security. It's a little bit out of date, but it also has some very good information in it. And again, it's very approachable.
But in terms of kind of you know, there is guidance on mobile medical applications that is out there. There's guidance on multiple function devices that has examples on smartphones and apps on smartphones that it's out there. But a lot of this stuff isn't. So, for example, what your testing, BYOD testing strategy should be, there's nothing out there for it. It's much more based on experience and, frankly, also, you know, evolution for the FDA. I think one of the things you can think about here is, you know, we're working on the working group for Amy on cloud computing. There's a consensus report on cloud computing that we worked on, and there is a technical information report that the FDA is part of that working group in terms of putting that out hopefully later this year. And sort of the core central issue that we are dealing with there is the cloud is not fully in your control. And how do you deal with that? That's the same issue that we face with smartphones and BYOD smartphones. So there's a lot that I think will likely flow out of that. That if the FDA ends up basically recognizing that as a consensus standard, that we may propagate out into other areas. But there isn't really a kind of a standard specifically around this kind of smartphone to device connectivity, right?
This may not be a fair question for this audience, but any comments on how other jurisdictions, other countries and regions are looking at this any differently or the same as the FDA?
Generally, the FDA and the EU and the other regulators are all pretty aligned. I'd say they're generally close enough that if you pass FDA, you're probably going to pass EU regulators and as well as Asia. I'm not sure if Jim has any more specific experience there, if anyone else here does.
One source that's really helpful to look at to see what the international regulators are thinking is the IMDRF, International Medical Device Regulators Forum. And there's some good documentation out there on cybersecurity generally. I'm not actually sure how well they've covered Bluetooth in their documentation, but that's a good place to look at what the international regulators above and beyond US and European Union are thinking on cybersecurity.
And I would say just on, you know, in terms of Bluetooth and the connectivity, right, with Europe right now, with MDR, there's still a lot evolving, and there's also some kind of, you know, shopping for notified bodies to get the right answer that's happening there as well. So somewhat in flux in that regard. I would say that in the more you get from a standard use case to something that is more complex and higher risk, the more variability you might end up with, where you will get a different answer. But that can happen, frankly, within the FDA as well, depending on who your reviewers are.
Mileage may vary. We're now at the point where we're getting into deep technical questions. Some of them I can group, and at a certain point, I'm just going to start reading them. And what I would invite the panelists to do is, if you see an opportunity here to abstract the question a little bit, by all means, go for it. So first one is, we've had a couple questions related about how do you approach V&V And how do you think about fragmentation specifically in testing? Because there's, it used to be 10 years ago, there were about 15,000 unique smartphone profiles in the US. That was sort of unique combinations of make, model, and OS version. We're now at 85,000 and counting. So Bluetooth is not Bluetooth everywhere. How do you, Bernard, you'd reference that a bit. So how do you deal with that at a high level?
Yeah, so I would say, again, FDA's favorite expression, use a risk-based approach. So think about what kind of testing you need to do. What at some point in the past, the expectation was you only allowed certain profiles to be used. So you had kind of still have the concept of an allow list and a block list, and maybe you have a sort of gray list kind of thing. And it was pretty much only the allow list was allowed. That's gotten loosened up a lot more in terms of how people actually do this. But again, it depends on the risk. If I'm doing a class 3 implanted device where I am controlling the device, I'm probably going to be a lot more rigorous in terms of the testing that I end up doing than if I have a pulse oximeter that I'm just getting a reading off of once. The risk isn't that high, and so I have to do a reasonable amount of testing. On the lower end, I would say, you end up with test a low-end phone and a high-end phone and a middle level phone. Or on the iOS side, frankly, you can test all of the phones. And then the more phones that you need to test, you end up building out testing farms to end up doing that. If you need to cover much more of the market and be clearer about it. And the last thing I would say is sort of, if you think about the kind of tiers of testing that you would do, is in some cases you can potentially do field level self-validation, where as you are initially connecting, you are testing whether the functionality works, right, in terms of verification strategy. And then obviously doing various monitoring and things like that as well, as part of your process for cybersecurity and for, are there any functional issues?
That's the architectural pattern known as only the paranoid survive.
There you go.
Okay, so some other ones. First of all, people are starting to drop off, although I'm still marveling that we're at 57 minutes, and I calculated quickly, 80% of the people who logged in are still here. So great, stay with us. But just for those of you who drop off so you don't miss it, we will be posting this on YouTube shortly. We will be doing a blog summary, hopefully by sometime next week, although don't hold me to it, it is a holiday week. And please reach out to us, directly with questions or about our services or about these things or other things you want us to cover. We'd really like to give a comprehensive view of this stuff. And we will be here until 1:30 Eastern, if there's enough questions. Okay, next question that came in was sort of like tooling. Okay, so what tools should I be using? And I think that is software and hardware tools. Like what should be in my toolkit if I'm doing Bluetooth development well?
Jim, do you want to take a crack at that?
And I believe you're referring to Jim Hewitt.
Sorry, and I meant Jim Hewitt, yes.
Yeah, I know, I just wanted to make sure.
There are several sniffer devices that are available on the market that provide tooling for if the concern is being able to capture data over the air on a Bluetooth device. Alternately, the IDE and the development environment that you're using to build out the application, the mobile application, certainly provides access to what is being received from the device itself. On the firmware side of things, several vendors provide IDEs and capabilities for debugging on the firmware side. The SDKs that are available from Nordic, from TI, from Micron, and from the other manufacturers all provide mechanisms for debugging the device side of things.
Anything to add on the cybersecurity side?
On cybersecurity, going through the risk analysis, ensuring that you are doing bonding and exchanging long-term keys. If the threat analysis is significant enough, you may want to consider doing app level encryption, as well as utilizing the long-term keys that are generated via the bonding process itself.
I would say one other thing that we end up doing a fair bit, again, is if we have lots of edge cases, it can be hard to test all those edge cases quickly and in an automated fashion when you are just testing with a device and a smartphone. And so we end up building out simulators. Sometimes those are, on a desktop. Sometimes those are actually on a smartphone that is acting as a peripheral where we can easily, go through large data sets. What happens if we're trying to do, FIFO after not being connected? First in, first out data transfer. If we haven't been connected for 2 months, how do we deal with, app crashes, intermittent connectivity, all those types of things are a lot easier in some cases to test that way than with a small implantable or portable device. Doesn't mean you don't have to test with those devices, but especially since much of the complication is on the smartphone side, testing that side of things with emulators or simulators, and then orchestration in terms of your testing farms is another thing that, again, for more complex, higher risk devices is worth the investment.
Now it's
As
also
a penetration
presumably-
tester, as a penetration tester, I would also say if you build those simulators, provide them to the firms that are doing your penetration test, because you'll get a lot better results, and it'll be a lot easier for them to do the things that an attacker might do if they have the same tools that you're using for your V&V testing. And as a side note, after the penetration test, you might get new test cases to add to your automated tests that will help you make sure that security issues they identify remain closed.
I would also add, and feel free to jump on anybody, but having simulators is also just a good software project management best practice, because it lets you get to issues earlier, lets you uncover things, and it also uncouples your smartphone team from your device team. So if the device team doesn't happen to deliver on the date promised, you can get further and not be held back.
That never happens.
Oh, my bad. Sorry. So a related question somebody had, I'm not sure if there's anything new. How do you replicate a field use environment to impact general RF interference, other Wi-Fi? What tools do you use to actually, how do you simulate all those physical use cases?
There are Faraday boxes available if in fact you need to do that type of simulation that will affect the ability for the device to communicate with the smartphone.
And I'd say in other cases, obviously there is interference testing, et cetera. There are labs that do a lot of that work, and you have to do that, from an FCC perspective as well. But I think it can be a challenge right? Especially for something like an implantable, where what you're doing is, you have to, it's sitting in the body and connecting via Bluetooth. So, having an appropriate lab for doing that type of thing is important. And then, again, depending on the environment that you are doing in, it's tough to simulate every single environment. You're probably going to be trying at some point to simulate the worst case environments that you can, with lots and lots of devices and lots of potential interference.
So at some point, it becomes
yeah.
a real infrastructure investment that you either have to
Yeah.
do in-house or outsource to somebody to get at a certain bridge point on simulation of the physical world or recreation.
Absolutely. In fact,
Simulation is just recreation, right?
Absolutely. In fact,
so-
we have done some work in the past with devices such as glucometers that are embedded, whereby the company manufacturing the device itself has invested in devices that simulate the body mass to affect transmission of the device for test purposes.
So it probably depends how often you do it, right? So one and done, or is this a constant need? A related question that somebody has here, which basically says is, the number of connected devices, exponentially grows. Are we heading for some kind of a train wreck in terms of latency, bandwidth availability, or specifically what is the impact of coexistence of Bluetooth and Wi-Fi at growing volumes with low-powered Bluetooth devices that need to use low power and depend on traffic that has low latency requirements? Is this stuff going to hold? I guess the question.
It's a good question. Obviously, we have seen this with Wi-Fi, where there's sort of, if you're in a building with lots of different Wi-Fi networks, everyone increasing the power of their Wi-Fi, and lots going on that front. So it is it is an issue. I think, it's hard to say with Bluetooth. It is the amount of Bluetooth interference, I don't really know in that regard. It's an excellent question. I'd leave it to others on the panel to answer that.
There's actually also I know in the attendee group, there's a couple of people from some of the Bluetooth chip manufacturers here. If you want to anonymously post a comment, because I know you're probably not allowed to put your name and face on it, I will be sure to read it out. Anybody else on that question?
I think from the standpoint of Bluetooth itself, Bluetooth SIG has done a lot in providing guidance for what capabilities it can bring to the party. In the cellular field, similar agencies have provided adequate guidance, I think, in ensuring that communications channels are capable and have enough pipeline to support what we're doing.
I would say that, hospitals and hospital systems, at least larger, more sophisticated ones, do look at their environment, and are you a good citizen within that environment? But if you are out in the wild, in people's homes, in public spaces, etc., that there is, other than the FCC work, there isn't a whole lot that is, preventing bad actors from polluting the space, right?
Couple of questions that I think are related. We're reaching the edge of my knowledge, but you could tell me, you can extrapolate or not. Are there recommendations for how to handle the mobile app termination scenarios where the iOS doesn't notify about it? Similarly, there was another one I saw. How do you restore iOS callbacks to ensure the search for BLE advertising always occurs? And then somebody also similarly asked a question about different versions of Android and inconsistencies in the implementation of any specifics. So go for it.
Both iOS and Android OSs, especially the newer versions of iOS and Android, do provide adequate events for detecting conditions when a device disconnects from the OS. And the applications can register to receive those events. The applications can likewise, on receiving events like that, renegotiate, start listening for advertisements if they are the central device, and requesting to reconnect to the device when they do see the advertisement coming in from it.
Anyone else?
As far as kind of differences between iOS and Android and kind of, on the iOS side, right, as we know, there's kind of a forced upgrade path. So you're going to update to the latest version at a certain point, or you're not going to be supported anymore. On the Android side, we have a much longer kind of period, and not necessarily the same mechanism per se. So we're going to have many more versions, and in each particular case, there's the Android spec, shall we say, and that's implemented first by Google on their phones, but each particular smartphone manufacturer has to take that and then translate that into their own kind of lower level firmware, which is why it typically takes 6+ months from when a new version of Android comes out for that to get on the flagship phones of say Samsung or Motorola, Lenovo, etc. That's one of the considerations, and then you have to test for those things. Sometimes you'll end up with weirdness on some one of those smartphones, especially on the Android side. But once in a while, you'll get that with OS updates on an iOS on a particular device. We've had that happen where certain functionality on the iPhone SE, and I think at some point on the iPhone 8, where we had some issues with it and couldn't support that for certain of our applications.
I believe in those cases, we ended up on the phone with the device manufacturers trying to narrow that down to the chip manufacturers. Couple comments people had on the network congestion question. One person said more tactically, do frequency hopping. The other person said, basically, this is a real problem, and we're going to have to work with the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi SIGs to resolve this at a protocol level, because it's already an issue. Okay, so here's a I like this question. Device labeling on Bluetooth. What's required? What's recommended? What have you seen?
Good question. This is something I would have more like our regulatory experts speak to, not necessarily my area of expertise, but we can certainly take note of that and provide that in when we talk about the regulatory side of this. I can make sure that we get that information from our folks.
Yeah, and Bernard, I'm not an expert in the labeling area, but that's an area, especially that Michelle Jump, MedSec CEO, can cover in pretty extensive detail. So maybe for a future webinar, we can address that as part of the regulatory element of it.
Sounds good.
Some of these questions are getting really deep, and I have a feeling we're going to start to go on a little too long, so we can put some of these offline, or feel free to contact us. And then some are really, I think, best suited. Come back for the cybersecurity webinar next, and you can get into some of the more detailed questions. Buddy and Jim, you've probably seen some of these here. So one last high level question that we sort of saw.
There was a lower level one that I've run across, right, with the whole, I think someone asked, have you used push notifications to wake up an app to reestablish a connection? And yes, that is, to get around the central peripheral kind of thing. It is where you're basically using push notifications from the cloud, from the from some back end, where you are pushing that down to the smartphone to wake up the application. It is doable, but it has a whole bunch of weird edge cases, and it's also been something where at one point we considered using it for one, and then in an OS update, Apple iOS update, it broke. So we're glad that we didn't use it in that particular case. It was something that was broken for a week or two, so that you couldn't do that. I think one of the things that you have to think about when you are doing background communication is that, if it's something is going to go wrong somewhere along the way, so you can't just say, oh, the user never has to open the application, and they can be just all this background processing can happen for 3 months, 6 months, etc., without them using it. That's not realistic. At some point, something's going to happen where you're off. So if you're really just using the smartphone as a relay or a modem, and it's you don't have any functionality for the user that causes them to open the application, you should probably just consider cellular connectivity instead from your device directly, because it's not worth a hassle for Bluetooth and for connectivity and dealing with all of those things if there's nothing that the user is going to get from the applications. One, they're not going to deal with the problems, and it's not worth it for you to do all the work that's involved with Bluetooth connectivity and testing, etc. So,
if that is a requirement, that is one advantage to classic Bluetooth, is its ability to actually launch an application if the application has registered with that classic Bluetooth device.
And will be backward compatibility with Bluetooth Classic be maintained indefinitely, or what can you assume if you're designing a device today?
It's going to be continued, yes. Obviously, Bluetooth BLE has a lot of advantages over Bluetooth Classic, but when you're connecting a keyboard or a mouse to the OS, that Bluetooth BLE does not provide any advantages in that scenario. Or a halter device in a case that we've done in the past.
So I think we're a logical conclusion, and we're still above 50% attendance. So I'll take that as a victory for us. Thank you all. One last question that I'll kind of summarize across a couple of ones we've gotten. What are you excited about, right? I mean, Bluetooth 5 is newish and coming into broad use. It's probably not the last thing. I think we agree, we're all just scratching the surface with connected medical devices. Where do you see opportunities on the technical side, or in terms of kind of specific disease areas or specialties? Where do you think some interesting things could be happening coming up?
I mean, I think I would say, right, we're probably going to shake out some more of the use cases that are, as I alluded to before, where you're really just using it as a relay. The fact that you can, potentially use cellular for some of those things. I think we're as the examples I showed earlier were, the trend of more stuff happening on the smartphone and on the cloud, the sensors on the smartphone, feedback on the smartphone, all the other things that you can get that you now combine with your medical device data, the ability to collect that data, put that out into the cloud, and then actually have machine learning, neural networks working on those things, surfacing new trends, and then actually feeding that back in. I think that's where we're going with a lot of this stuff. So Bluetooth is just, one of the things that we're using, but it's really in general more connected, more data, and more ability to analyze and feed that back into the process. We keep seeing new things, and the envelope keeps getting pushed in that regard, and it's not going away. It's just going to accelerate, frankly.
And I think later in summer or fall, we'll probably do a bit of a hiatus. We're planning that the last webinar in this series is going to be a forward look at if you're designing devices or thinking about your product portfolio of devices now for 5-10 years out, what should you be thinking will be there or won't be there, so you can start thinking bigger and not just in terms of what we have at our hands today.
From the FDA's perspective, I think it's really important to keep in mind that they're really re-emphasizing or emphasizing the total product life cycle of that technology, and from like a cybersecurity point of view, from MedSec's vision, addressing the cybersecurity risks throughout the entire life cycle of that product is going to be just more challenging as more and more Bluetooth or other wireless functionality gets built into these devices, and more data gets transferred, and all that. Keeping track of all that is going to be an important part of the design and management process for these medical devices.
It's going to stop thinking of it as a separate thing and just think of it as an integrated part of everything.
Yeah, and I wanted to just throw something out to Buddy really quickly related to that, is like when we're doing our penetration testing for like Bluetooth enabled devices, and Buddy can speak better than I can on that, we're asking these companies to provide us with access to the full system, not just like the Bluetooth communication piece of it. Is that a valid point, Buddy?
Definitely, Jim. When we're doing penetration testing, one of the things that we think about is the threats that we know about today. But penetration testing, I look at it as a necessary, and the FDA looks at it as necessary. But even before that, before you're done with your design, you shouldn't be waiting until you're done to do a penetration test, and then we find a bunch of issues, and now you've got to go back to the drawing board. So one of the things that's really been emphasized lately is a threat model. And your threat model should include an attacker has kind of got a device between your mobile app and your medical device, and they've paired with it, and they're intercepting and modifying messages. And what kind of bad things could they do? It's really important to think like an attacker. So don't think, well, it's impossible to send a value of more than 100 units of glucose because our app won't do that. Well, I'm not your app. I'm a bad guy. And so making sure that you've thought about these threats and thought about what's the worst thing that an attacker could do, whether it's intentional or unintentional. The other thing to keep in mind is post-market. You release these devices, they've got a lot of firmware on there. A lot of these chipsets have vulnerabilities that are waiting to be discovered, like Blue Snarf was a big one that resulted in denial of service. But if you've got a good threat model and a good risk process, you can already say, well, we know what happens if there's a denial of service. Our device still functions safely with reduced usage. And now we're going to use our firmware update process to update these devices to mitigate that entirely. So I hinted at another thing that's really important, which is updatability. The FDA is very, very, very strongly insisting that your devices have updatable firmware. You want to make sure you're doing that securely.
Yep, and especially I would, if what you're doing is something that's implanted or something that's out in patients' hands in some way, right? Thinking about that, you can't, do going out and fixing that for people isn't possible. This is why you end up doing over-the-air updates using the smartphone as part of the process, which again can be done securely and is is more and more a part of it. Whenever you're connecting a system, you're going to have more vulnerabilities, but also more ways of potentially detecting those things and dealing with those things. And obviously the power that comes, the reason you're connecting something in the first place. So it's going to get more challenging for sure. The more we have interaction between devices and non-devices and functions, etc., the more we are in a truly interconnected world where what's happening in one place can influence what's happening in another place. The cybersecurity permutations are going to multiply along with the power.
Yeah,
Those
well,
over-the-air updates are so huge. You think of a medical device analyzer company that has analyzers, literally, thousands and thousands of these things around the world, and the ability to, wholesale update the whole fleet and get data and analyze the utilization of that whole fleet through the over-the-air updates and communication is just really exciting.
excellent.
For sure.
Well, thank
Yep.
you to all the panelists. Thank you to all of our attendees who have hung in with us, and we will be back with more. So please join us. Look forward to continuing this conversation, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.